Soon it will have been 20 years since I was a fellow at Harvard Divinity School. It was a wonderful time in my life, my first time to actually get to sit in a classroom as a student since my grad school days in the 1980s. As I was preparing to leave Boston, the late Harvard chaplain, the Reverend Peter Gomes, surprised me by calling me aside to privately say goodbye. He said, "I've enjoyed having you in my class this year, but I realized that none of this was new to you." And I hadn't expected to have a personal conversation with Peter Gomes. I just nervously said the first thing that came to mind, and I said, yeah, none of it was new, but I think I was finally ready to actually hear it. Please forgive me if I take too much of your time giving you my personal life story, but suffice it to say that I, like you, have not always been the person that I am today. I grew up in rural Kentucky, the youngest child of a working-class family that had been shaped by their own rural Kentucky childhoods, barely surviving the Great Depression and World War II, the massive technological changes that took them from dirt roads and horseback transportation and oil lamps in the house into what we call the modern world, with the arrival of automobiles and electric lights and appliances and telephones and television, air conditioning, and finally a very strange child who went to college and then went to college again and then went to college again and again. I presided over their funerals early in this century, extolling their ability to adjust to so many dramatic changes in the world they inhabited. But the other side of the coin was the things they were not willing to change. I spent many Sunday afternoons of my childhood in the living room of the old plantation house of my family's former slave plantation, listening to my father and his siblings literally still grieving the end of slavery and mourning the poverty that the Civil War brought to my family for many generations. They were convinced of the inferiority of the black race. But their prejudice didn't end there. They also despised Asians and Jews and Catholics and any non-British foreigners, as well as anyone who ever used drugs or drank alcohol or who smoked. For their entire lives, it was as if the Civil War was last year and the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor was sometime after breakfast this morning. Their hatred and judgment were intense and life-defining. My college career nearly ended in the first year when I came home and shared with them the emotional trauma I experienced of having my gay English professor make a sexual pass at me. I'd never even heard of homosexuality prior to that day, but I sure heard a lot about it after that, and it wasn't good. Sadly, many of my family members and even my high school peers have never ventured very far from that world. My initial escape from that tiny mental cage came to me actually through the Christian faith, had me reading the Bible, and reading the Bible even as a teenager showed me that the culture of my hometown was Christian in name only, with a hypocrisy that was so obvious to me and yet apparently invisible to my siblings and certainly my parents and most of my school peers. My second salvific influence was education. I earned a degree in philosophy, and I will readily confess I didn't understand a bit of it. But the Gospels, like philosophy, gets into your head when you read it, and then as you mature, you are able to think back on it and realize what it meant. I took my largely traditional faith to seminary with me at Vanderbilt in 1979, and through a master's and doctoral program, virtually everything that I had been certain of in 1979 was revealed to be theologically and historically as well as ethically false. I can credit the faculty at Vanderbilt with exposing us to the best of religious scholarship while letting us have enough room to hold on to some traditional Christian language that made it possible for us to keep our jobs as ministers in the more liberal Christian churches around the country. I think now that that was a mistake. We probably should have been more definitive about it, but we were taught how to keep one foot in the academic world and the other foot in the church that needed to believe that somehow their pastor believed in the supremacy of the Christian religion and that the Bible, even with all of its human frailties, was still somehow the Word of God. At funerals, they needed for us to assure them that heaven was real and hell, though real, was not a threat to the people that we love, the people that shared with us a very narrow worldview. I managed to straddle that fence for almost 30 years. I focused my work life on mental health, opposition to war, promoting poverty projects, fighting prejudice, still clad in the religious vestments and surrounded by the hymns and symbols and rituals of Protestant Christianity. What finally broke me out of that compromise, frankly, was when I was fired in 2007. The multiple traumas I experienced in that year destroyed any loyalty I had felt to institutional religion. My denominational judicatories revealed themselves to be dishonest in ways that would have brought shame to the mafia. And the church members who were offended by my public conduct of same-sex marriages, my protesting of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, in the mix of people who also wrote letters just condemning me because I drove a convertible or that I lived in a loft downtown instead of in a suburban home like they did. It was an ecclesiastical dumpster fire that would have embarrassed Charles Darwin. Still, some very sincere friends who were so outraged by this miscarriage of justice were determined to put me back into a pulpit, and several of them sacrificed tens of thousands of dollars that they arguably could not really afford to donate, but they did it to employ me and to buy a small church building that kept me in the ministry. Still, even after all that, our first services looked an awful lot like the last services that I had conducted in my former denomination. For another 4 or 5 years, I followed the lectionary. I wore vestments. I even did a few baptisms. But we were trying to figure out what it meant to be an entirely honest spiritual community that owed no fealty to denominations or traditions or even to Christianity. It took me years, though, to demythologize my own language, to move beyond Trinitarian holidays and songs, to fully embrace an interfaith approach to spirituality. We initially described ourselves as being progressive Christians. We named our church the Community Christian Church. We even tried to grow into enough of a traditional church to have Sunday school classes and youth groups, a choir, and special holiday services. But the Council of Churches initially lumped us in with the Unitarians and wouldn't let us join the Council of Churches because we were not what they thought of as being Christians, even though, as I pointed out to them, we supplied more volunteers and donated goods than any other church in town. But years later, they changed their minds. They invited us to join the Council of Churches. But by then, I'd joined a Unitarian church. I figured they were right. So I invited the director to come and stand in my pulpit and tell the congregation why we should join the council when they had refused us membership 10 years earlier. I had come to agree with them. I'm not really a Christian if what they are is Christian. We abandoned our original name and began to call ourselves the Emerging Church. Most of us have Christian roots, but we are decidedly now without theistic practices or beliefs. We have no sacraments, no holy writ, no authority beyond our appeal to critical thinking and testable reality. And the only time I put on a collar or a robe is when I'm afraid I might get arrested at some activity that I'm involved in. There's an apocryphal saying attributed to Harriet Tubman that claims that she said that she could have freed 1,000 more slaves if only they had known they were slaves. Now, she didn't say that, but Sometimes I think maybe she should have said that. Almost all of us were brought up in bondage, a mental prison from which only a few ever escape. Most of us have to keep kicking at the darkness of ignorance, mythology, guilt, fear, and prejudice for our whole lives. I've often tried to sum up this process of gradual escape by quoting the comedian Martin Mull, who said that the town where I grew up had a zip code of EIEIO. For all the things that we inherited from our families of origin and the culture in which we were nurtured, almost all of us also know that there were some very dark and ignorant things that we have had to work to overcome. My parents never got over being embarrassed about my adoption of an Asian child. And they found my friendships with gay people to be too painful to even acknowledge. And frankly, I don't feel obligated even posthumously to forgive them for that. Yeah, they didn't know any better, but the fact remains they could have known better. And because they could have, they should have. They should have put their backs into it and tried harder. They never read any of the books that I published during their lifetime because they knew they would be uncomfortable with what I said. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. Mythology, superstition, prejudice can only survive in intentional darkness. Now, we can understand a child being afraid of the dark, but I don't have any sympathy for an adult who is afraid of the light. But folks, this is not just a problem among conservatives and the untutored. Liberals can be bigots too. I was scheduled to speak next month in a Unitarian church in my home state, a church where I've spoken before, and a church that I've really wanted to help grow and survive. But I have canceled that engagement after I heard a recent recording of a service from that church in which a church member delivered a sermon that was advertised as an appeal to unity and tolerance and everybody should get along. But the body of the message was a very personal and slanderous screed condemning me, using me as the example of what no one should be. She explained that my sermons were politically divisive and that she was also just horrified when I had said in their pulpit that the zip code in my hometown was EIEIO. She breathlessly talked about how embarrassed she would have been if one of her rural relatives had been visiting on that Sunday and heard me say that. But I didn't cancel my engagement there simply because these things were said, but more to the point, no one contradicted her. No one pointed out the obvious hypocrisy of talking about unity while condemning me. Apparently, the only way to be an honestly spiritual person is to be just like her. And how is that unifying? In her mind, sermons should avoid political topics like opposing illegal wars, opposing poverty, racism, denying health care or housing or employment to poor people, and keeping gay and trans people deeply in the closet. She didn't mention one word about how prejudices of my native land had kept black people poor and engaged in menial labor and kept gay people deeply hidden in closets, or allowed our government to pursue illegal wars without challenge. She was only upset that I had mentioned these things in public. In short, she wants to have a very liberal church that either endorses or by silence tacitly approves of every single failure of fundamentalism with all of its moral indifference and irrelevance. And inasmuch as progressive churches would rather be polite than prophetic, then they should decline and they should close because they're just in the way. The worship chair evidently sent me the video as a warning to be sure I didn't offend her again by saying something controversial. My friends will recall I've said a few times that I hope that I live my life in a way that Westboro Baptist Church will come to demonstrate at my funeral. I want racists and homophobes to be made to feel uncomfortable by my sermons. The last thing I want to do is to comfort people who perpetuate war, poverty, gender discrimination, and hypocritical piety so that they can feel normal in the space that they've carved out for themselves. We are obviously not invested in incarnational Christian theology, but at the root of the gospel narrative is the fairly reliable historical reality of the execution of Jesus by the Roman government. And you can't possibly believe that he was crucified for being a moderate. If he had avoided politics and just told people to love one another, he would have been a useful friend to the Roman government, not a victim of state murder. Being loudly and clearly opposed to oppression is not a political opinion that is the same as being in favor of oppression. The anti-slavery movement in the church of the 19th century was not on the same moral footing as the pro-slavery churches of the 19th century. One was right and one was wrong. Those of us who have worked for the civil rights of the gay community are not the same as the people who have opposed gay rights, because one of us was right and the other was wrong. Being liberal doesn't mean that you have abdicated from making moral judgments and making them clear. As Elie Wiesel said, neutrality always serves the oppressor and never the oppressed. Therefore, we have to choose sides. And if you're a preacher, you had better make it painfully clear which side that you are on. Yeah. It's not our goal to simply shame or embarrass bigots and racists, but it is our goal to make it very painfully clear that the ground that they have staked out is unacceptable. People try to dismiss progressive preachers by saying that they're too political or too divisive. We are all subject to being dismissed by being labeled as being too woke or too liberal, or saying that we are socialists, as if advocating for a living wage or universal health care makes us somehow the same as Stalin and the early Russian communist revolution. How you deliver universal health care or eradicate poverty may involve politics, how you do it. But if you are defending a healthcare system that leaves millions of people out of it with no access to healthcare or to an economic system that leaves people working 2 and 3 jobs and still sleeping on a park bench, then I submit this is not politics. This is morality. And the church damn well better be talking about it. Of course, that is just my opinion, but it has the added benefit of also being true.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.